some of the most chilling stories in the Bible. Tales about legendary cities destroyed by the hand of God. Sodom and Gomorrah, incinerated in a hail of fire and brimstone. Jericho's walls, tumbling down to the sound of trumpets. But are these stories fact or fiction? Archaeologists are beginning to uncover some answers. Evidence of a catastrophe is everywhere. But does it support the Bible's account or point to something else? It's one of the oldest stories in the world. A tale of two cities whose names are practically synonymous with sin. Sodom and Gomorrah. Over the years, the story of what happened to them has become a titillating parable of sex and pleasure. A moral fable about corruption and sin that comes with a price tag. Which may be why it seems so relevant today. Judging from the evidence, the urge to satisfy the body's various appetites is hardwired into most humans, and some places are known for being party towns, where it's hard to tell the difference between enough fun and too much. "4,000 years or so ago, Sodom and Gomorrah had that kind of reputation. Although the Bible never says exactly what they did to deserve it. Genesis simply says, "Now the men of Sodom were evil and great sinners before the Lord." Later on it mentions abominations, but it doesn't spell out what they were.
We have very little information, actually, about exactly what was going on there. I think that's why Hollywood, among others, is so fascinated by Sodom and Gomorrah. It's open to whatever you want to think. What was going on there? I don't know, but it must have been bad.
But if the Bible is vague about the sins being committed, it's clear about the punishment. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire out of heaven. The Bible goes on to suggest that after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, they were abandoned. If the biblical story did happen, it probably happened here, in the empty, desolate lands next to a lifeless sea. But even that's not certain.
Like many things in the Hebrew Bible, it's hard to actually pin down a location for places. The Hebrew Bible talks about the 5 cities of the plain. The nearest we can get today is thinking that they're somewhere around the shores of the Dead Sea, say in modern-day Jordan. But even that is a best guess.
According to the book of Genesis, the story took place in the time of Abraham, centuries before Moses made his getaway from Egypt. Abraham was apparently the patriarch of a tribe of nomads who avoided the towns and cities, which may be why we know so little about them.
City dwellers were usually the people who wrote the history. Nomads usually are archaeologically invisible. What we have in the Old Testament and the writings of these very literate tribal people who eventually became city dwellers themselves, is we have the nomads side of the story.
The Bible tells us that Abraham's tribesmen were constantly fighting with each other over pasture land. To settle the dispute, Abraham and his nephew Lot agreed to part ways, and Lot settled on the plain near the city of Sodom. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot moved his tent as far as Sodom. So Sodom was already an established city when Lot moved there. And if it was a typical Bronze Age settlement, about 1,000 people lived inside its walls. No one had ever found any evidence that such a city ever existed. But then again, no one had ever really looked. Until an archaeologist named William Albright made a trip to the Dead Sea in 1924.
Well, some of the people with him were certainly looking for Sodom and Gomorrah, generally the cities of the plains. So they came down there following the biblical text, and they circled around the southeast end shore of the Dead Sea. And just at the end of their survey down here, they came across the site of Babadra.
Babadra was a Bronze Age site, but there was no evidence it was a town. It seemed to be a cemetery, and Albright didn't have the resources to excavate it. So nearly 50 years passed before anyone went back to the site and began to dig. Archaeologist Paul Lapp led that 1967 excavation, and Thomas Schaub was one of the people doing the digging. He's been back to the site many times since, uncovering over the years a cemetery that was vast, even by Bronze Age standards.
This is the largest burial house that we've excavated at Babadra. It is some 15 meters long and 7 meters across. We found hundreds and hundreds of pots here and skeletons and bones. We found a burial with gold jewelry. We excavated over 700 pieces of pottery that were funerary gifts here, including many small perfume juglets and many other objects, including cloth, and one unusual, the remnants of wooden poles that were used as a pallet to bring in the bodies to the burial house.
It was an exciting discovery, a graveyard that had been in use for about 1,000 years, around the time of Abraham and the destruction of Sodom. But there was nothing to link the cemetery to Sodom except this. In about 2350 BC, the burials stopped. Suddenly. And no one knew why.
There are any number of reasons why a site might not be reoccupied. Some we can put our finger on, some we can't. Perhaps the water supply dried up. Perhaps the environment changed. Perhaps the climate changed. Perhaps the people were annihilated and completely killed.
Over the next few seasons, the archaeologists expanded their search, looking for signs of a lost city. And it wasn't long before they found something. Traces of human habitation on a hillside overlooking the cemetery. Stones and more stones. Pottery shards and dirt. Lots of dirt. That's what the archaeologists at Babadra were up against in their search for the biblical Sodom.
There is a fascination with what has once been lost and yet now is found. This is what drives some archaeologists and to a larger extent the general public. This idea that something could have been built and then completely lost and yet is there under the earth waiting to be found.
To moviegoers raised on the exploits of Indiana Jones, this kind of archaeology probably lacks a certain amount of glamour.
Indiana Jones is back.
You'll notice that there's not a lot of